While that's coming around, let me introduce our teacher for the next few weeks. So we have, well, before I do that, so how is it going so far? You enjoying the symposium?
Great.
Okay, so we've had some good teachers, studied some great material. We are going to continue now with our next series. Rabbi Jeffrey Weill is the rabbi of Ezra, Habonim, Niles, Township congregation in Skokie. And he is going to be teaching us about the book of Ezekiel. So I'm honored and really excited to have Rabbi Weill here. And I know that you're really going to enjoy studying with him. So let's welcome him.
Thank you. The honor is mine. Thank you, Rabbi Stoller, so much. I knew when I was putting on my blazer this morning, I knew that Rabbi Brian Stoller would also be wearing a blue blazer. It's the Reform Rabbi look. And, we co-taught a Introduction to Judaism class here several years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know. And we were, I just remember that. Well, we didn't actually teach together, but I guess the one time that we did, we were dressed the same. Whenever I say that,
But you ironed your shirt.
okay, good taste, exactly.
Did you iron your shirt?
Did you iron your shirt?
I iron my shirts, by the way. I iron my shirts so often that I move the ironing board into my bedroom. It used to be in the laundry room. I'd have to just take it out and take the iron. Now I just keep it there. In fact, the iron's always on.
And you wear 2-piece and hats.
So, did you see an ironer?
Yeah.
It's a lost art. My wife is not a good ironer. She's not a good ironer. So I am very, very pleased to be with you to talk about Ezekiel, a word of warning that I study with, I don't know if any of you know Rabbi Yehoshua Karsh from the Northbrook Torah Learning Center. Anyone ever studied at the Northbrook Torah Learning Center or see Rabbi Karsh? I study with him weekly. It's a lot of schmoozing, but it's all we study Talmud as well together. And when I told him that I was teaching Ezekiel, which, by the way, I've never actually taught only Ezekiel. I've taught prophets, and we'll talk about prophets in general as well. When I told him I was teaching Ezekiel, I think I saw him wince. Because Ezekiel is like the verboten book. The sages were, first of all, very, they were reluctant to even canonize it, to put it in canon, to include it in the Bible. And then even then, there was a reluctance to translate it into the the lingua franca, whatever that would be, Aramaic or whatever that was at the time, because if it's, better just to know it's there, but not to actually understand it, because it's a challenging book, and it's theologically challenging, and it's just it brings you to places that the rabbis are concerned would essentially blow our minds. And so I'm going to do a disclaimer now. I'm not responsible for anyone's mind being blown, but it is quite a book. We're going to start. I'll start with a little summary of Ezekiel, the world in which he came from, the book itself, and then we're going to get into the text. If you want to turn to it now, it's on page 1155 in the Hebrew English Tanakh, and in the English one, it's on page 893. But we'll get to the text in a bit, and when we get to the text, it's going to be a close reading. And I'll probably ask people to read bits at a time, and we'll do it, really verse by verse, and get into it. But now, a bit of a summary. I will tell you that some of my remarks come from. This is actually my rabbinic thesis, which was on. This is back in 2007. It's called "Force and Dialogue: God's Relationships with Isaiah, Amos, Amos, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel." And so we'll talk really about the nature of that relationship, the divine prophetic relationship. But let's start with this. When I say prophet with PH, what names come to mind? Who? You think of whom? You think of what? Isaiah, very popular, of course, because most of our Haftarot come from Isaiah. Jeremiah, good. Any others? Amos, good. Hosea, very good. Yeah. Miriam, okay, nice. Joel, good. Moses. Good. Moses. Okay, good. So it's interesting because you all said, you said a couple of Torah prophets who are a little sort of different from the prophets who are in the book of prophets. You know, of course, we have a whole section of the Bible called Nevi'im, or prophets, and we have there are really two kinds of prophets now. I'm excluding Miriam, who's called a prophetess, and Moses, who of course is prophet, but later sort of much more than that. But of the prophets themselves, within the book, within the section of the Tanakh, of the Bible called prophets, there are two basic categories. There are what we call the classical prophets, which is what you mentioned, and there are the pre-classical prophetic books as well. You all mentioned the classical prophets. Those are the ones like Ezekiel, who essentially had a message to convey. They spoke in a certain way, and they were talking to either the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom in Israel, and they had specific messages to convey to the people. We'll look at that a little bit more. The pre-classical prophets come from what we also call the historical books of the prophets. So any ideas as to what the prophetic historical books would be?
Kings.
Good, right. So it starts with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And no one mentioned, by the way, Elijah, which I usually hear, he's like a prophet different from the other prophets. He's a pre-classical prophet. The nature of those pre-classical prophetic books, number one, they're quote unquote historical. They tell the story, the narrative about the first couple centuries after we entered the land of Israel. We talk about there are prophets in those books like Elijah, Elisha, Nathan, and others. But we also hear about them, these prophetic bands, these bands or groups of prophets who go around the countryside and in the city. And anyone remember how they're acting? What the qualities of their prophetic work is? Yeah. Yeah, they're sometimes called the ecstatic prophets. You mentioned spinning, and dancing, spinning, singing. Some scholars say that they drank also in order to put themselves into these ecstatic states. Really, it was like a lot of dancing, and they did something called the Hit Nabed. The Hit Nabed, which is, I'll put this up here. I'll do it in my script. That's a ramen. The Hit Nabed. You'll see that the shoresh here, the roots, the root of every Hebrew word is I'm sorry?
3 letters except when it's half.
Exactly. Very good. 3 letters except when it's not. It's usually 3 letters, sometimes 4, sometimes 2, but usually 3. And for the 3-letter root or shoresh of, is this legible even for script?
Yeah.
Okay. Is here, as in
Eliyahu
Nabi, right? That's prophet. And to do Lahit Nabi is a form of prophetic acting among the ecstatic prophets, which really usually often translates into speaking in ecstasy. So that would be even like glossolalia. Glossolalia, like speaking in tongues. That's a very important thing. They did that. By the way, Saul, the first king of Israel, the sort of overlooked king. Hard to overlook him because he apparently was very tall. He was described as that. But people often, when I ask the first king of Israel, they usually say David, who's the second king. But Saul even got wrapped up in doing a little ecstatic prophecy, I think before he was anointed, or sometime before or after he was anointed as king. I think before. I think after he was anointed. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is that they made noise. They spoke in this glossolalia, speaking in tongues kind of way, but they weren't saying anything. They didn't have a message. And the difference between those pre-classical prophets, or ecstatic prophets, or prophets from the historical books, all the same, difference between them and the latter prophets, like the Isaiahs, Ezekiel's, Jeremiah's, Hosea's, Amos's, and so forth. The later prophets, or poetic prophets, they had something to say. In other words, they had a message. It is true that some prophets, like, we see Elijah, who's an earlier prophet, and Nathan, they certainly convey important messages. political and theological messages, but those are usually individual kind of focused messages to focus people in focused situations. The later prophets that we've discussed, they had messages, and to whom were they speaking? They were speaking to the people, whether it was the southern kingdom of Judah or the northern kingdom of Israel. They were speaking to all the people with their messages. And you can actually see, if you want, Ezekiel is not a good example of this actually, which we'll talk about later on. But just flip, say, into Jeremiah, or especially Isaiah, or even flip in the other direction. And what do you notice about these words? I just flipped to Hosea. It's verse. In other words, that was their medium. Ezekiel, interestingly, is a little different. There is verse in Ezekiel, but there's not as much as most of the other prophets. He's unusual in that way. But they were, think of like, I don't know why he comes up necessarily, because it makes sense. But Bob Dylan, in the early years, when he was really trying to convey a message before it became sort of more, with this surreal imagery and stuff like that. But he was trying to convey an important message as a very young man, and he chose verse and song to do it, and many others as well, of course. So the prophets were sort of like that. They were trying to speak in a way that people would hear it, and that they would understand it, and that they would learn from it. By the way, did they learn from it? Or did we? No, we'll see that as well. That we were actively, adamantly opposed to learning from the prophets, to changing their ways. That's why they kept on talking to us for centuries. And alas, nothing changed, which was a great frustration for the prophets, by the way. They knew that. They were told, we'll look at this later on, they were told that they would speak, and the people wouldn't listen. Talk about a frustration, But we'll talk about that when we actually look into the text itself. So, any questions about anything we discussed so far? Anything at all? Okay. So. Ezekiel, the man. Okay, we'll just do a little bit more about him, his time, and then we'll get into the text. His name is, you can see it on both opening pages. Right. Ezekiel. Right. What's the shorish here? What's right? Chazak. See that's here. That Chet Zayin Kuf, right there. God will strengthen, which is a symbolic name for him. It could apply to other prophets as well, but we'll see early on that he had to be strong. God in fact made his face strong, and his forehead strong. We'll see this with Jeremiah too. And some of what we'll be doing is actually comparing a little bit of the call narratives. In other words, when these prophets were called to prophecy, we'll look at the respective call narratives, comparing Ezekiel to Jeremiah and to Isaiah. Okay, so Ezekiel, where was he preaching? What century? Anyone know where he was?
600
Right. And what was going on during that time in the 600s? 500s really. 6th century. 6th century. Right, well he actually, yes, right before the destruction of the temple. He was, when was the destruction of the temple? 586. And where did we go at that time? We went to Babylonia. And by the way, we all went? No, in fact most of us didn't go. Most Israelites didn't go. Who went first, by the way, and when? True question. Yeah, the leaders of the community, I think people with money, the leaders, they were exiled earlier in 597. Had that right? Yeah, 597. They went earlier. So there was an earlier exile before the temple fell by a decade, an earlier exile of this select group from Jerusalem into Babylon. And Ezekiel was a leader of that group. Now, what was Ezekiel's lineage? Anyone know anything about Ezekiel, what his background was? Priests. Yeah, he was a Levitical priest. He was from the house of Zadok, with Zadi, I think. So he was a priest. So he was both a priest and a prophet. But what is a priest to do when there's no temple, or when he's far away from the temple? Of course, they use the he on purpose. He happened to be a prophet as well. So he was able to, and we'll see that in his preaching, he evokes the temple over and over again. In fact, he's got a very long section on imagining the restored temple. So Ezekiel was a priest of Israel, and he was a prophet. His time preaching was a span of 20 years or so. Scholars believe that. Exiled, as I said, to Babylon in 597. It was as he knew, as he could tell, it was a very successful, exilic, exiled community. Why would that have been a source of concern just to Ezekiel, to others? Why would that be a problem? Why wouldn't you want the exile?
It threatens the priesthood.
Well, yeah, it does threaten the priesthood, right, because they're not going back to the temple, that's right. And just in general, as we see over and over again, when we're successful outside the land of Israel, or even, I would say today, even in the land of Israel, the fundamentalists among us, get very upset with those who want to accommodate the dominant culture in which we're existing. So other times in history when this was a concern, sort of keeping the faith versus assimilation or accommodation. What else did this? What else? I'm sorry?
The Enlightenment.
Okay, the Enlightenment is good, very good. Yeah. Other times? Whenever it's good. What's that? Others? How about the Maccabees during that time? Right? How about today? Also? Right? So, I mean, we're reliving this. So these stories, I think, are fascinating. That's why I think Hanukkah, which is actually not too far away now, is, we call it a quote-unquote minor holiday. I think it's the great American Jewish holiday. I really do, because it tells our story in a way. And we're still kind of at, we're still having this conflict between, just like the Maccabees. Most of us would not be, we elevate Judah. I am now centuries away from Ezekiel. I have now time traveled centuries away from Ezekiel. But we quote unquote, so we lionize the Maccabees. We elevate the Maccabees. Most of us here, I think, wouldn't really, I think, be sticking up for the Maccabees because they were extremists. I mean, yes, the Romans were doing unspeakable things to our tradition, but they were non-accommodationist. And that's kind of what Ezekiel was experiencing as well in Babylon. He was, even after a generation or two generations, this community was so entrenched already. And by the way, they were making money. They were making money as well. And so a half century or a little more later on, when King Cyrus of Persia allowed us to come back and to rebuild the temple, what happened? Most people didn't. Most stayed. Listen, 1948, when we had the Third Commonwealth and the state of Israel was founded, did most people in diaspora go to Israel? No. Same dynamic. The book of Ezekiel itself, just a little bit more background. Style, as I said, is more prose than the poetry of most of the other classical prophets. By the way, the classical prophets are also called frequently the literary prophets for that reason. They speak in verse. The setting is primarily Babylon. Some sections might predate Babylon, but that's what we're going to talk about in a little bit. The structure follows a sort of natural pattern for prophets. It begins with an introduction and a call to prophecy, which we're going to get to very soon. And called doom oracles. Is it okay if I'm walking away from the mic? Can you all hear? Is that okay? It has doom oracles to Judah, By the way, not to Israel at this point. Why not to Israel? Israel's gone already. Right. 722, I think, BCE. Israel is absorbed into the northern tribes are absorbed into Assyria. So first an introduction and the call to prophecy. Then the doom oracles against Judah, that's the bulk of the book. Then oracles against foreign nations, because the classical prophets also got into geopolitical kinds of issues. So you're speaking against foreign nations. And then this is where it gets to be very prophetic in a way. As bad as things get, as angry as the prophets might get, as scathing as they might be in their criticisms of Israel, calling them all sorts of names and making us feel generally very bad about ourselves. In the end, and also saying, your doom is sure to come. What usually happens at the end of these books? Right, the restoration. I don't know about every Haftarah. I think probably is every Haftarah. I'm not really sure. But most of the Haftarot that the rabbis chose to go along with their Torah portions, they often have critiques, and then they end and saying, God's going to, do stern justice. And then in the end, there's a restoration part at the end saying, God will take us back. So towards the end of the book, we have that. And then we have the sketch. Ezekiel ends with a sketch of a sort of idealized form of Israel and of the temple. Okay, that's the structure. That's the structure of the book. Theology. Given the fact that Ezekiel is speaking during the exile, what do you think might be some of the theological points that he wants to make? Just kind of, what would you think as a prophet and priest speaking hundreds of miles away in the exile as the Babylonians are taking over the land of Israel, and also, by the way, ultimately destroying the temple? What do you think Ezekiel might be wanting to convey to the people? Yes?
Well, if God is good, then you must have deserved what happened.
Okay, good. There are two themes there. That's very good. Number one, where is God? In other words, bad things are happening. Where is God? That's called theodicy. The theology of evil in the world. How does God let bad things happen to good people? That's theodicy, not the Odyssey, which is a different thing altogether. But theodicy, theodicy, the nature of God and evil. How can God let evil things happen? And number two, sin and punishment. What we did, we must have done something wrong. These things are not, history is not random according to, the ancient world and to the prophets. History is not random. In other words, our land is being destroyed. We are in exile now, despite the fact that many of you enjoy the exile, But we are in exile now. We must have done something wrong. We deserve this somehow. Listen again. There are recurring resonances throughout our history. Post-Holocaust, after the Holocaust, Jewish philosophy changed. You couldn't be a Jewish philosopher after the Holocaust and not deal with certainly the first issue, God and evil. You couldn't do it. You can't be a self-respecting late 20th century Jewish philosopher and not deal with that question: where was God? Is there God? So Ezekiel is sort of facing the same thing with the temple being destroyed. So number one, theodicy, the nature of evil, and where is God? Sin and punishment. We must have done something wrong. The next one, number three, is, ironically, but he's a priest. The temple is destroyed, but it's still central. So it's interesting in a way that after the temple is destroyed, it's almost in our literature elevated. You sort of took it for granted, and when it was there, maybe. Not really. It was still central. But in our literature, some of these writers, like Ezekiel certainly, and others as well, raised the nature of the temple. It became a symbol of something so great. It wasn't actually concretely there, but it became a symbol, so it's kind of raised in importance. So part three of his theology is the centrality of the temple, and that it will be restored. Of course, it was restored later. And then fourthly, as we've discussed, we're talking about theology in Ezekiel. Fourthly is consolation. God will take us back. We can repent and God will take us back, and the temple will be restored, and everything else. And that actually, you can say a lot more subtle things about it, but that actually happens. Okay. Finally, the history of the book as part of the canon, that's sort of what you could say the canonical history of Ezekiel, is that, as I said, it was viewed with suspicion by a lot of the rabbis. A lot of them, wanted to not believe that it was actually, this is early on, as the Bible was being compiled, redacted, didn't want to believe that it wasn't Ezekiel. They said it was written more recently by some other author. They were concerned about it because it's got like a volatile book. It's an explosive book. And so they were concerned about it. In Chagiga, the tractate of Mishnah, of a Talmud called Chagiga, there's a warning that says you can only delve into Ezekiel if you were sage, fully comfortable with his own knowledge, it says. In other words, fully comfortable in Torah and Jewish everything before you can even get into Ezekiel. We'll talk about some of this later on as well, maybe next week or the week after. So you can't just and so that's why I'm giving you a warning and a disclaimer. But it's like a dangerous book. And also, as I mentioned in another tractate of the Talmud, the Megillah tractate about Purim, it discusses this as well. And I think I said, okay, it's here now. It's part of the Bible, but they were reluctant to have it translated, which is really ironic. Really ironic. I know for sure. Very often we pray stuff. Especially in my congregation is not a Reformed congregation, though I'm a Reformed rabbi. And I know very often that we pray stuff in Hebrew, and people have no idea what they're praying, which is a source of frustration to me. I think there's something valuable to the process of prayer, the mantra-like quality of it, perhaps, and the communal aspects, and that's all good, and maybe getting the gist of things. But very often people are very happy to see it in the Hebrew, but not
What's the original language?
Hebrew. Yeah, this is it. Yeah. I think Rabbi Solar can qualify this if it's not exactly right, except for there are two places in the Bible where there's a little bit of Aramaic, and I forget one of the places actually. But it's a later book. Anyone want to guess where, like a later book where there's some Aramaic?
Esther?
No, not Esther. Daniel. That's right. Daniel has some Aramaic in it, although mostly Hebrew. And Rabbi Sola, do you recall? Because I don't. There's another part somewhere where there's some Aramaic. Where I don't know. We can Google that. Where is there Aramaic?
Is that the cottage? Well, the cottage, yeah.
Well, the cottage is Aramaic, but it's not in the Bible. So yeah, it's liturgical. Right, so there are lots of things within the liturgy that are in Aramaic, like the Be'an Arachis, as we take out the Torah, Be'an Arachis, which is really beautiful. Very often not done in Reform world, but it should be right. Well, it's really quite beautiful.
Yeah, but they don't do it here.
Yeah, well, I know, yeah. Maybe you've seen it some other places. Okay, so where are we now? I have no idea. I don't know, we've lost. There's a long outline. Okay, we've done this, we've done that, and so I think now we'll get into the book. Okay. So first, let's just start with this. What might it feel like, do you think? Just kind of like without any preconceived notions as to what you might know from the books. But God says, if God were to come to me and say, Jeffrey, I'm going to make you my prophet. What might that experience feel like? Imagine God coming to you and saying, you're going to be like in Oh God or Oh God 2. And saying, what might that feel like? What might that feel like? What would that maybe feel like to you? What do you think that you would be experiencing emotionally in that moment? Just anyone. Yes?
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming is a very good word. Good.
Frightened.
Frightened, okay.
Running away crazy.
Run away, think you're going crazy? Okay. Okay, what's that?
Why me?
Why me? As in terms of like, why me? I'm so lucky, or why me? God me alone? Okay, that's interesting.
Also different from this way.
Okay. Okay, well, okay. Any other reactions like different from that? Yes.
Well, I mean, first thing is, how could it even occur? You first you'd have to personify God.
Yes.
And then,
Okay.
or would it come in some other spiritual form? Or in some ecstatic?
Oh, I see. Okay, so in other words, God, how would it even occur? Assuming that, oh, God is not an accurate, really rendering of what happened. But yeah, but there, it's actually, yeah, in other words, God, how would that even happen? Like, how would that even happen? And as we'll see, there's personification in a lot of these call narratives, these calls to prophecy. How would it even happen? Good, yes?
Will it hurt?
Will it hurt? Oh, very nice. Yeah, the answer, of course, is yes, it's going to hurt. But God very often steels us against that pain. Yes?
And you can't discount the person that has a big enough ego to think you've made the right choice.
All right. God, what took you so long?
What an hour.
Yeah, I'm waiting, God. Right. Well, all these answers are actually excellent answers. I mean, in fact, reflecting what the prophets felt at that moment. But I was expecting something different entirely. Because I actually once asked, in fact, this is how my thesis begins. I was having a conversation with a friend, and this is at the time that I was working on the thesis. And I asked her, like, what the same question, and she said, oh, it'd be like a beautiful feeling swept away by God, and so nice. And it's like singing Debbie Friedman's Miss Shabera. But in fact, as we'll see from Ezekiel, that's not at all the case. It is. And we'll compare this also to Jeremiah, to Isaiah. Maybe we'll get into Amos at some point as well. A little bit. Those are the four primary call narratives. And you understand what I'm talking about when I say call narrative? God calling the individual to be a prophet. God? I'm ready. What took you so long? That's not. If I were called, I would scream and. Probably become incontinent and faint. Yes?
By being called.
Yes.
I mean, God came to Moses and called Moses, but this seems like a different thing.
Right. Well, actually, it's not so different. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, Moses is definitely different, but it is similar. In other words, Moses was suddenly arrested by God's call. Moshe. And Moses also had fear. And he said, "Me anochi." He had that humility to say, like, "Who me? Who am I that I should do such a thing?" The people won't listen to me. Like we discussed as well. So that's really what I mean by call. And in fact, it's very often a literal voice that calls. Or with Ezekiel, it's way, way more than a voice. But it is, just someday this suddenly happening. That's kind of that's what we'll see in these four call narratives. Yes?
He can come as a revelation in your mind.
Okay, well that's a very good, interesting question.
And I have to interject, Rabbi, I attended some of your services at Niles Township, Reconstructionist congregation it is, and you do beautifully in your explaining and your interpretation of the prayers to these folks who just like to dive in all day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are Reconstructionists and we're also conservative, by the way, and I'm Reformed. And the cantor is Orthodox. Isn't that beautiful? No, it's just confusing is what it is. Okay, so what we will see is a sensory, and this is what I think that we see. You can tell me as we start to read in a couple minutes if you think this is a right reading. But I see a sensory assault that overwhelms the prophets. Physical manipulation of the prophet's body, actually. The futility, a message that the message from God that the prophet's preaching will be futile. It won't work. Some loss of personal autonomy, maybe even an erasure of the prophet's individuality, but that's something I'm going to say a little bit more about. And yet through it all, despite that, the prophet continues to be himself. And I'm saying him because we're talking about all males in this case. just want to read one thing from Abraham Joshua Heschel. Has anyone read Heschel at any time? Sabbath and some other things, perhaps, yeah. You know, I do. I love Heschel, and who am I to even judge Abraham Joshua Heschel? But as part of my thesis, I read his 2 books on the prophets. He wrote 2 books called The Prophets, 1 and 2. And he's very difficult to read, actually. He writes beautifully, like almost poetically, but to kind of find the core message in there, you really have to read. You really have to read closely. So I'm actually very proud that I read those 2 books cover to cover and found what I think is a real message in there. Talking about, just getting back to this as we get into Ezekiel, we talked about the pre-classical prophets, those ecstatic prophets. Heschel had little regard for them. He thought that they were poor excuses of prophets, despite the fact that they were keeping up aim. You know, they were doing that. They were speaking in ecstasy, but like becoming prophets, like that's the word that's used. But he had little regard for them. He didn't like the fact that they, number one, had no message, and that their selves were erased. This is a very key thing for Abraham Joshua Heschel. He saw the ecstatic prophets, you know, ecstatic. Let's take a look. See if I can even remember. So, what do I do? Okay. And sometimes I start to write in English and I think I'm writing the wrong way. Honestly, I do that. Ecstasy, right? And so what does that mean? Oh, it's nest. Sorry. Ecstasy. So what does this mean, actually? So this is like the E, see, like the EX, which means what? Outside of. And like stasis. Like the, how do we say, what is stasis? Or it's like status. Yeah, outside normalcy, or outside time, outside like regular existence. So he did not like that. That they go somewhere else. They have nothing to say, and they lose their individual selves. He saw them, even though they are, how do you say, like get enthused by the divine spirit, carried away by it. They're not in relationship really with God, because they're lost as human beings. He liked the classical prophets like Ezekiel, because they are not outside of stasis, they're not outside of time, not outside of regular existence. Despite everything that happens to them, they maintain a relationship with God. They are in dialogue with God. And sometimes it's hard to see, but this, of course, was Heschel's very 20th century sort of message. Is our sort of like a as religious existentialists, we don't lose ourselves to God. We maintain ourselves and are in dialogue with God. In fact, what's really beautiful about Heschel is that he sees the prophets as feeling. Someone said this before. Feeling what God feels. He calls it sympathy with divine pathos. That's what happens. Not merely understanding what God is feeling, understanding God's anger, not merely proclaiming God's word, but actually feeling what God feels. That's the fascinating part of this. Like, you become a prophet, you're taken by God, and you have sympathy, like the basic sense of sympathy. We feel the pathos, sympathy, right? You know, we are at one with the pathos of God, the suffering of God. We feel it, and that's what the prophets are reflecting. Okay, so I'm not even sure what I'm talking about, but how that can happen. But I'm glad we talked about it. Okay, so here we go. Are we ready? Mm-hmm. Okay, would you like to have we have people take turns reading? I will interrupt you with annoying frequency as we do this. But let's go back to Ezekiel here. Which is back. Which I said this was on. Okay. So it's gonna be a slow read, and we have another 50 minutes or so, and if we have time, we'll get through this calling, and then go back to look at Isaiah and maybe Jeremiah today, if that's possible. Okay, so 1155 or the other book, 893. Would someone like to read? Please.
Jesus
13th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month.
Yeah, that's,
30th.
Oh, 30th, I'm sorry.
it's okay.
On the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of exile by the Kabar Canal, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God. And on the 5th day of the month, and it was the 5th year of the exile of King Yochanan, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Uzi, by the Kabar Canal in the land of the Chaldeans. And the hand of the Lord came upon him there.
Good, stop there. Okay, by the way, what do you notice here?
Third person.
Yeah, exactly. It starts with first person, and then it has third person. So there's some editing going on with all these books. There's editing going on. It's primarily a first person book, but there's a little bit of early editing going on and an insertion there. I, by the way, love the first sentence. Just the English itself is great. I'm just going to read it again. In the 13th year, on the 5th day, sorry, very fashionable. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of exiles by the Kabar Canal, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God. That's like a Hemingway kind of opening sentence. I think it's really good opening sentence. It's a very clear, puts you in the right place, and then tells you what happened. Okay, so. Something begs the question here, by the way, right at the very beginning. In the 30th year of what? It doesn't actually say the 30th year of what. So, what's that? I'm sorry?
Fourth month is it?
Oh, the 5th month? Yeah, but I'm talking about the year, the 30th year. Yeah, it doesn't actually tell you what the 30th year of what?
The exile.
Okay, so some say the exile, but that's not really possible, because it says on the 5th day of the month, the 5th year of the exiled king, and it's actually Yoachim, which we know was happened in 597. It says elsewhere in the book of Kings, I think, when he was exiled. That's 597. So that's I think I've read that that's a possibility, but it doesn't seem possible if it's the 5th year of the young king's exile. So some say it was. The 30th year of his commission as a prophet, and maybe he'd been commissioned as a prophet 30 years earlier. Some say 30 years after King Uzziah's or Josiah's reforms, those big reforms in which we found, quote unquote, found the book of Deuteronomy, which is a later book than the other books. And some say, at least the Jewish Study Bible, which is a good academic text, say it's his age, his 30th year, that he's 30 years, which makes sense in a way. Remember who he is? The Levitical priests, at what year do they start their work? What age? They go from, in the book of Numbers, it says from 30 to 50. 30 to 50. So it roughly correlates to his time here. So,
another footnote.
yes.
It was the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle.
Oh, interesting. Didn't see that.
Right,
Is that
the
Rashi? Is that the stone or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Any other translations in the house? Okay, but I'd be happy to hear, more of interpretations and translations. That's helpful, actually. I didn't see that. That's good. That's good. So the Kabar. Look, the canal. I can't actually find it. Kabar. This is an offshoot of the Euphrates. I think it says just north of Baghdad, but then it continues and goes about 60 miles south of Baghdad. So we know where we are. Okay, we are placed geographically. We're in Babylon. Okay, so that's where he is. And so interesting. What do you see about the? First it says what? It says that the word of God was upon him. So visions, and then it says the hand of God, right? Which is interesting. Word of God we've seen. Hand of God, I just don't really recall if we see that a lot. But take a look where it says, just do a tiny bit of Ivrit. This is that first paragraph, the last line, or actually the second last line, the last word, Vatahi, you see that? Vatahi, Allah. I'm sorry? Vatahi, Allah, Sham, Yad, Adonai, right? And it was upon him. Where I lost it again. Vatahi, Allah, Allah is like upon him, which I see as foreshadowing. The hand of God was upon him. This is not a gentle thing. You might think it's not like God putting God's hand on Ezekiel's shoulder it's something, I think this is ominous foreshadowing of what's about to happen to Ezekiel. The hand of God is upon him. It's not merely the word. It's going to be fascinating also how the word comes to be in him as well. But don't give it away if you know, because I like this suspense. Okay. Okay, by the way, it says the word came upon him, but the rabbis did not really approve of this notion that the word of God came to him for the first time in Babylon. Why not? What's the difference?
Exile is not home.
Right, exactly. It's not home. It's not in Israel. I don't think it has to be Jerusalem necessarily.
Well,
But-
because if he was a priest.
Oh, good. He was a priest, so that would have been a natural place. But in general, they didn't like to think of prophecy originating outside Israel. It can continue outside Israel, but they didn't like it beginning outside Israel. It had to happen in the land of Israel, in the Promised Land. So they were a little reluctant about that. Okay, so let's go on. We're now beginning the what's called sometimes the inaugural visions of Ezekiel. And as we read this, as we've discussed already, in the next 24 verses actually, what are you feeling? Imagine that you're Ezekiel. It's sort of like a little bit of bibliodrama. What would you be feeling in this situation? So can I have a reader beginning with verse 4? Okay, please.
I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire, surrounded by a radiance, and in the center of the fire, a gleam as of amber. In the center of it were also the figures of 4 creatures, and this was their appearance.
Stop there if you don't mind. Okay, so these are, what are the elements that are happening here? Yeah, wind, cloud, fire. Okay? This is a theophany, right? God's revelation of God. And like we see at Sinai, there's also like the mountain was. These are also usually sort of pyrotechnic kinds of events with thunder and lightning, fire. The Mount Sinai was on fire. So this is a theophany. By the way, what's another place where you see is?
Can you compare it to the burning?
I think you can. Yeah, it's very nice. I think you can compare it to the burning bush, which is burning. Yeah, very good. What other individual, by the way, that we, it's really poetic, beautiful imagery of, I guess it's a little bit different, but I'm thinking of Elijah.
Yes,
Going up the mountain and seeing, I don't remember everything exactly, but there was a whirlwind and God was not the whirlwind, and there was a fire, God was not the fire, there was a storm or whatever it is, God was not. But I mean, but you sense that the theophany is coming, but where is God? Ultimately there, in a still small voice. Elijah had it easy, right, compared to what Ezekiel's about to experience. And we have here these creatures. You see the word for creatures here? In Ivrit, what verse is that? In the center, it says figures of 4 creatures. So verse 5, it says, Arba Chayot. What are Chayot?
Animals.
Yeah, living things. Yeah, like Chaim, like we say, L'chaim, to life. These were things with life in them. As we're going to see, these were the cherubim, or cherubs. Cherubim, but they're not like the cherubs that we see, in old Hallmark commercials or anything like that. I don't know how we got from these cherubs. And by the way, in chapter 10, these are described again, and they're referred to as cherubim or cherubs. Here they're only referred to as creatures. I don't know how we got from these fearsome creatures to cherubs, like as we typically think of them, so soft and cuddly.
Maybe have those
Babies.
cherubim over the ark as well.
That's right. Well, good. Right. Over the ark and over the entrance of the Holy of Holies, there are actually 4 of them altogether. We'll see that there are 4 of them here as well. And why is that meaningful? Because this man's a priest, so he's thinking temple. So a lot of the imagery here, we'll see a little bit of this in Isaiah too, but especially for Ezekiel as a priest, the imagery of his theophany is what he knows, or what he cares about. So the cherubs, these creatures that are in the temple, hundreds of miles away. How many hundreds of miles is it from Jerusalem to Baghdad? I don't know. I have no idea. But hundreds of miles away, he's seeing what is familiar to him and what he wants to associate with God. Okay, Understand that? Good. So we move on. What are these chayot like? Do you want to continue reading? A short bit?
They had the figures of human beings. However, each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. The legs of each were fused into a single rigid leg, and the feet of each were like a single calf's hoof. And their sparkle was like the luster of burnished bronze. They had human hands below their wings. The 4 of them had their faces and their wings on their 4 sides. Each one's wings touched those of the other. They did not turn when they moved. Each could move in the direction of any of its faces.
Okay. Can you imagine sending like a Hallmark Valentine's Day card like this? Halloween card maybe. But I don't know what to say about this. Let's try to imagine. I actually went online to look at some artistic renderings of this.
Right.
Yeah, it's wild. What I was confused by for a while, but I understand now. I think when it says they did not turn when they moved, each can move in the direction of any of its faces. So it's not like they, going up, down, to the right or the left, or I guess back and forth and to the right or the left. They just, there's a face looking in each direction. So they just were going like that without having to do that. Okay. Any thoughts, impressions?
Weird.
Weird. Weird. Yeah. Yes.
It's 1,217 kilometers.
Okay. So what would that mean in terms of miles?
600
Okay.
miles.
600 miles?
And
A little less, right? Isn't it less?
you go a little north and then straight east.
To get to Babylon.
Yeah.
Yeah, north and then east. Okay, good. Yeah, yes, yes.
Why? I mean, obviously, there's a reason that they made them look like this. Have people, have scholars studied that and they come up with any conclusions? Why 4 heads to each one?
Yeah.
Was there a purpose to this?
Yeah, I don't know. They're yes. Well, the faces are all different. Midrashically, I've heard something that the faces also represent, unless I'm getting confused as to maybe it's the wrong 4 faces, but that they represent different nations. But the sages said something I think even more interesting. That do they tell us the faces yet? What they look like yet?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Okay, so did we get there yet? No. So let's get there. Then we'll talk about that. What verse are we on?
10.
Okay, so just stop for a moment there. Take a look at verse 7. What does it say? It's fascinating, actually. Verse 7 again. The legs of each were fused into a single rigid leg, and the feet of each were like a single calf's foot, and their sparkle was like the luster of burnished bronze. Ka'ain, it says. Ka'ain's like sort of like an eye of, sort of similar to. Why? Why is he saying that? It's such a vivid, detailed description. Why is he using a simile in a sense, or saying like it was like this? And he thought that the rabbis wanted to know too, and some offered an answer, or scholars offered an answer to this. Why do you think he's saying, I have this very detailed image of this theophany, of these creatures, and then of God as well, and I'm saying it looks like this, it looks like that.
Could it go back to the golden calf?
How so?
Burnished goldish, and it's a calf's foot.
Oh, interesting. Maybe. I can see that being. It's certainly. How does he must know that? But of course, this is Dafka. This is God. But and that Dafka was not. So, but I like that. I did not think about that connection physically. So thank you for that. Yes.
Maybe he's trying to connect it to something that people there know, and if you think about the statues and the temples in Chaldea and Babylon at the time, that's kind of what they look like. It's what the Oriental Institute in Chicago.
Oh, okay, very nice. And in fact, these kind of cherubim, these creatures were not just ours. These different forms, but they appeared in religious art and architecture throughout the ancient Near East. You had a thought too? Okay. Yes, one, two.
Could it be possible that he did this to attract the people from the get-go? Something possibly they were familiar with?
Okay, good. Yeah, so the
like
same kind of
just
comment.
kind of get them
Right, so maybe
roused right off the bat.
that's a very good thought, that he was trying to do something that would resonate with people. Also asking that issue, like, why is it like this? and like that. Why does he say Cain? Cain, I think. In other words, just why doesn't he just say it looked like it was this, it was that. It had this, it had that. Yes?
Was any of the temple furniture on legs being on it?
Well, there
Could
were.
it have been a reminder of the bowl or the altar or something?
Also,
where they stood
really,
on
really
it?
interesting. I don't know. I mean, there were tables there, but the description of the cherubim in the temple itself are not detailed quite like this. If I remember correctly, I have to look back.
I'm talking about other things in the temple, the bowl or the.
I don't know. Yeah, there was a table. There was the table for the showbread. So maybe that is he talking about that too. But yes, then we'll.
To me, these beings or these creatures are like ghosts. You can see right through them. But once you say that they're like burnished bronze, you're not only giving them form and shape, but you're giving them another dimension, the dimension of color.
Right. Okay. So that all this will add, as we read on, we'll see, to the sensory, the fullness, the sensory assault that overwhelms the prophet, as we're going to see. But I was just saying, that's the word Cain, similar to, really is what it means, or like it, as opposed to it was this. The rabbi said, and some other modern scholars say, well, can we see God? Do we know what God looks like? Does God have a body? No, as one of my, I like to quote one of my medieval Jewish philosophy teachers from rabbinical school, Rabbi Lenny Kravitz, not to be confused with Lenny Kravitz, but rock star, a great, he's actually in town now, he's in his 80s, and he would sing to us, God ain't got nobody, because God ain't got nobody. But here God has a body, and so the reason that they say Cain,
Not God, though.
well, he ain't. What's
Not
it?
God, it's the.
Okay, but we're going to see God as well. So you're right. This is not God, but we're going to actually see God too. And the reason that Ezekiel is saying it's similar to this, it's similar to that, because it's a vision of God, but how can you visualize God? Because rabbis, sages were squeamish about this notion of depicting God like this. It happens throughout Torah and throughout the Bible, but we're uncomfortable with it because you can't depict God. Can you imagine? A rabbi or a teacher like these days saying God looks like this? No. And so the rabbis, when I say rabbis, I mean the sages of old, seize on this Cain to say, well, Ezekiel didn't really see this. It was like maybe like an internal image, and he's trying to evoke it somehow, but you can't really see God. Yes?
Well, I was going to say, you're trying to communicate this to people who are not fully literate, but they may be intelligent. They got to understand something. It has to be brought to them in a way that they can, not quite touch, feel, and smell, but at least get a handle on it.
Right. Okay. Good. And so we've had that sort of comment. A few people have alluded to that. Like you have to speak in a language people can understand. Right. And so you have to describe something that people can actually hold on to. And it's a potent image. Yes.
So in Ezekiel's vision, this could be his representation of God.
That's exactly right. That's the Cain. In other words, it's a representation, but and the rabbis want to say like, okay, we don't really see God. But I'm not saying that's what Ezekiel was feeling. I'm just saying that our tradition is squeamish with this physicality of God here. And so as much as we're going to get into this, the rabbis later on saw this as like, oh, it's Yoter Madai, it's too much. Like we don't really do this. I think there's one other comment, and then we're going to move on. Was there someone else? Yes, please.
If I'm Ezekiel and I'm going to make a speech and I want to get an audience, I'm going to really grab you right in the beginning.
Right.
And this is going to grab anybody. If I'm walking past him and he's speaking outside, I'm going to stop and listen to this crazy story.
Right. Okay.
I think it's really grabbing.
Okay, so it is grabbing, and that's a good comment to have in our minds as we begin to read on. But I just want to say this: I don't think Ezekiel was feeling that. In my opinion is that Ezekiel just like Isaiah later on and Jeremiah, like they actually saw something. Okay, that's my feeling, is that they saw something, and maybe there was something in the spirit of the times in those centuries where people were more open to those kinds of experiences, those kinds of visions. Maybe you were of a certain mindset, maybe it was something like just kind of in the culture that kind of thing could happen. I don't know, but I don't think, I'm not saying it actually happened like this, or that you actually saw this in an exterior kind of way. I believe that though that he saw it. Okay, that's just my opinion. For him, I think it was real. For him, it was real. Okay, so let's move on. Where are we now? Verse 10?
10.
Okay, so let's get to the faces. Another reader? Anyone? Please.
Each of them had a human face at the front. Each of the four had the face of a lion on the right. Each of the four had the face of an ox on the left. And each of the four had the face of an eagle at the back. Such were their faces. As for their wings, they were separated. Above, each had two touching those of the others, while the other two covered its body. And each could move in the direction of any of its faces. They went wherever the Spirit impelled them to go without turning when they moved.
Okay, stop there if you would. Great. So those faces. We have a human face. This is a sage, some clever sage or other. I like to say that because the sages were, we think of the sages, the rabbis of old, Talmudic times is like, I don't know, looking, behaving, thinking a certain way. Many of them were like literary critics. They were creative readers of the text. They weren't just these. I don't want to minimize it at all, but they were not all legalists. They were not all deeply involved in like the fine points of halakha. Many of them were. This is where midrash comes from. They were creative people with great imaginations. I imagine them like in cafes in Vienna, with berets and drinking espresso. I don't know. I've never been to Vienna, so what do I know? Greenwich Village, say. So the human face represents intelligence. The lion face, royalty. The ox face, strength, right? And the eagle, interesting, mobility. Which some clever creative rabbi or others said that this is what these faces represented, and they're all aspects of the divine. Okay?
Excuse me, did you say mobility, nobility?
M, as in
Mobility.
Yeah, mobile. Yeah, going mobile. Yeah, but right, the lion is like nobility. That's royalty. So the mobility is an interesting one. The eagle is mobility, but you see, this is mobile. Maybe the idea that God is ubiquitous. Maybe that's the sense of the mobility thing. Like wherever you go, top of the mountain, bottom of the sea, you were there, God. Maybe that's the mobility aspect of it.
What did you say the human face represents?
Intelligence. Intelligence, royalty, strength, mobility. Okay. And okay, let's move on. We're on verse 13. Is that right? Okay. You want to continue reading?
Such then was the appearance of the creatures. With them was something that looked like burning coals and fire. This fire, suggested of torches, kept moving about among the creatures. Fire had a radiance, and lightning issued from the fire. Dashing to and fro among the creatures was something that looked like flame.
Okay, great. Great. Burning coals. Remember that Ezekiel's a priest. So what might this be evoking for him? Why the burning coals? What was that? Sorry?
Sacrifice.
Oh, sacrifice. Yes, exactly right. The burning coals on the altar of sacrifice in the temple. Right. Right. So this is what he is. This is what he's. These are his images to refer back to. Okay. We can go on. Another reader, verse 15. This is the wheel, which I wanted to do more research on the wheel. I didn't actually get to it. I wanted to look at another source. So would you like to read? Okay, the wheel.
As I gazed on the creatures, I saw one wheel on the ground next to each of the four-faced creatures. As for the appearance of the structure of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. All four had the same form. The appearance and structure of each was as of two wheels cutting through each other. And when they moved, each could move in the direction of any of its four quarters. They did not veer when they moved. Their rims were tall and frightened. for the rims of all four were covered all over with eyes. And when the creatures moved forward, the wheels moved at their sides, and when the creatures were borne above the earth, the wheels were borne too. Wherever the Spirit impelled them to go, they went. Wherever the Spirit impelled them, and the wheels were borne alongside them, for the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. When those moved,
When those moved, these moved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when those stood still, these stood still. And when those were borne above the earth, the wheels were borne alongside them. For the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels.
Wow.
Wow. Very weird.
Yeah, that's the second weird I've heard. Right, and so, where's the, thank you very much. So I don't know how I can actually do this, but each wheel seemed to have, each wheel was really a set of two wheels together, right?
There's an eraser at the bottom.
Okay. So I don't know why I'm doing this, there's no way I'm gonna make this intelligible. My brain can't understand it, so how can my hand do it? But like, the wheels are something like, and so, I'm sure whatever you can do is much better than I can. But sort of like that, anyway. Something like that. But I imagine them kind of like this. Right, so they're able to go in, that's the mobility thing, they're able to go in any direction. And the eyes on the wheels, that's the thing that I couldn't, that's not really good, right? It's more like that, and maybe just like that. Something like that.
Maybe like a gyroscope.
The gyroscope, I don't know how I would even do that, but.
No,
Like moving to different.
And of course, there's the eyes.
headlights.
Headlights, okay. Rashi say anything about that? The eyes? Yeah, Rashi's like, I'm not touching that. I do have a book in my office of traditional commentators that I'm going to look at that. It's the Judaica Press series of Nach. You know what Nach is, by the way? It's good. You know, everyone knows what Tanakh is. Talmud, Nevi'im, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, prophets' writings. Nach is just the prophets and the writings, Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Without the tough, that Torah. Right. So I have a commentary on Nach, traditional commentators. I will look that up. That's what I had left at home at synagogue. So, because I'm curious about those eyes. What do we do with those eyes? And why was it frightful on the top of the wheels, as opposed to elsewhere on the wheels? You know, it's wild. It's wild. But the wheels are ofanim here. Ofanim. Anyone know how you say bicycle in Hebrew? Ofanim. Yeah, two wheel. Ofanim is two wheels. Ofanim, like bicycle, by bicycle. Two circular wheels. This is ofanim. Yes.
This is fascinating. To me, this is describing a simple machine. Long before the simple machine.
Interesting. Yeah, like the simple machine being something that can do that.
I pictured gears with one wheel moved and the others.
And fascinating. Yeah, fascinating.
It was a great song when we could say Negro spirituals.
Yeah.
About Ezekiel.
Oh yeah, sure.
Wheels
Yep.
and way
That's right. Yeah.
The second one about the hand of God, a wheel within a wheel, it turned and way in the middle of the air.
Nice. Yeah, I know that song. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, very good. Right. You didn't sing it for us. You didn't sing it for us, though.
Oh, you don't want to. Way up in the middle of the air.
That's right.
Ezekiel saw the wheel spinning way in the middle of the air.
There you go. Yeah.
I'm from the south side, so we
You sang. Yeah. That's good. Excellent. Okay. Good. So we move on. Verse 22. Verse 22?
Yeah.
I'm always getting lost. Okay, above the heads. Another reader? Anyone like to read? Okay.
I can say it.
Right.
Above the heads of the creatures was a form, an expanse with an awe-inspiring wing, as of crystal, spread out above their heads. Under the expanse, each had one pair of wings extended towards those of the others, and each had another pair covering its body. When they moved, I could hear the sound of their wings, like the sound of mighty waters, like the sound of Shaddai.
Wow.
A tumult like the din of an army.
Wow.
When they stood still, they would let their wings droop, and from above the expanse over their heads came a sound. And when they stood still, they would let their wings droop.
Okay, wow. The auditory experience here, the sound, right? What's the sound? It says first, storm, was that it? Let's see. What was, is it storm first?
Mighty waters.
Mighty waters. I mean, just trying to get in there, like a waterfall, like a rush of a waterfall. And then Shaddai, which, as it says, is translated as Almighty very often. Shaddai was like the mountain god. When Mount Sinai was on fire and thunder and lightning and everything, that's like when we refer to the mountain god, it's that god, the god of like that sort of physical power.
And the din of an army.
And the din of an army, I think that's interesting that it comes last of those three. We have the rushing waters, then we have God, the Almighty God, and then we have the din of an army. I would have imagined we could go the other way. Waters, maybe, I don't know, waters, army, God, army, waters, God, like ending with God, but this doesn't really matter. But just get the sense, like, and we'll see this in Isaiah too, this is a full sensory assault. Everything is happening here. What we don't actually have here is smell, I don't think, at least not, it does not describe it. But but you mentioned a full sensory assault. And the threefold, description of the sound is just really trying to just overtake the prophet. What's the prophet feeling, by the way? I'll hold that question. What is the prophet feeling? What is happening to the prophet emotionally, psychologically? Yes?
Well, he described two sounds that he's going to experience.
Uh-huh.
The third sound he hasn't experienced.
Shaddai. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, two of them, right, good. So the two sounds that he has experienced. I don't know, the sound of an army, I guess that he's experienced that.
Could hear that.
Certainly could have, especially since he's an exilee, carried away by the Babylonians, So maybe he did hear that awesome sound, right? But also you have to think about God is described as the God of hosts, Adonai Tzvaot, and Tzvaot is a name for like armies as well. So there's that aspect of it as well. Okay, so what's happening to Ezekiel here? What's happening to him? Thoughts?
I picture him totally engulfed in this experience, not only emotionally, metaphysically, but physically.
Physically. Yeah. Good. Okay, engulf. I like that word engulf. I've never used that word before. Yes.
I've never taken drugs.
Exactly what I was going to
Yeah,
say. I was going to say.
Don't be shy.
Psychedelics.
It would be like you're on a high.
Like a hallucination, like an LSD trip. Yeah. Good. Very good. I'm pleading the fifth. Did you have something to say?
I was going to say LSD.
Okay, good. Yeah, yes.
This is extraterrestrial.
Yes.
Above the earth.
Very good. Very, very nice, by the way. Two points there. Number one, it does talk about what's the word for the expanse here, right? You know what the word in Hebrew for expanse is here? What do we use in Rakia? That's what we use in Genesis. In the creation story, there's a Rakia, a firmament, usually sometimes called expanse, that it's hard to actually figure out even in Genesis what it's doing, but it's that space separating the waters from above and below, that firm place, firmament. So this is like just on the other side are the heavens, and in fact that's where this throne is, right? And yes, there are some people who say that this was in fact, just like they talk about the pyramids and Stonehenge and that sort of thing, that this was in fact an extraterrestrial vision. That is, and I've certainly heard that this was a drug trip as well. Who knows what they were ingesting? I've heard that too. There's here's someone. Okay, there's someone else. You just made a comment. So, yeah, please, one and then two, then we'll go on. Yes, please.
It seems like he's getting revved up to give the message to the people. Like this is really getting him on, to give the message to the people. He's getting all psyched up to give the message to the people, and unfortunately, they're not going to listen. And interestingly enough, you could kind of place this in the world we're living in right now, where these people are getting revved up to give the message to us, and we're not listening.
No, that's absolutely true. We'll get to both those points in a moment too, because as psyched up as we think that he might be getting, let's take a look. We're going to see what actually happens to him. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just, on this, lady mentioned drugs. For those of you who've seen the movie, The Story of the Eagles, the group, you know.
Oh, the Eagles, yeah.
Yeah, at some point, when they're getting together, they get a new manager, they're all sent out into the Sonoran Desert.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, or something, yeah, and they're given paiutes.
Peyote, yeah.
Shoe.
Yeah.
And they're supposed to envision and come to, and as this develops, oh, of course, that's where the name Eagles came from that experience.
I didn't know that.
But the description of all of this, although you're not getting these visions, but you can almost see them and then create that vision in the movie of where you're getting all sorts of visions of things going crazy in your head. And then I thought it was just interesting, it came to mind when the eagle face came up, you know.
Yeah, Eagles, fascinating.
Yeah.
I did not know that the Eagle's name came from a peyote, which is what Mexican comes from too, vision.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, I did not know that.
And it was planned, I mean, not to come up with the names of the Eagles, but they were supposed to come back with visions and concepts.
Do you know, that's good. Do you know who the Eagles, maybe before they were called the Eagles, who they were the backup band for?
Oh, yeah, Linda Ronstadt.
Linda Ronstadt, yes.
Yeah, but not all of them, just Anthony Fry.
Okay, two of them. Okay, gotcha. Thank you so much. Awesome. Rock and roll.
Who would have known?
Okay, we're going to move on, right? We have rock and roll trivia. By the way, speaking of rock and roll and drugs, Paul McCartney said, I was thinking about this, that he said drugs, he meant hallucinogens, open up some doors, but not all doors. And at a certain point, it's inapplicable to our lives. It might open you up, for that time, but then apply. You can't live that way.
No, but they wrote great music.
Well, that's another interesting question. People talk about the Beatles in this way too.
I saw David Bowie's exhibit downtown,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is great, by the way. But it opens up, because they have written that kind of music if they weren't
All really
impressed.
interesting, but the question is, I actually had this conversation with a poetry professor at Brandeis where I went. I was an English major. Alan Grossman, who was a noted poet, not Ginsberg, but I did meet Allen Ginsberg too, which I'm happy to tell you about twice. But Alan Grossman insisted that while they might have, that these, like the Beatles, he said, they did obviously do hallucinatory drugs, but they couldn't have written their music. He insisted they had to write their music while they were quote-unquote sober from it. They might have had the inspiration from it, and maybe this applies to Ezekiel too, or maybe I'm just trying to tie this conversation back to Ezekiel. I'm not sure. I'm just, okay, anyway, let's move on, because I'd like to get to, we actually get another 10 minutes. Where are we, 26?
Yeah.
Okay, reader?
Above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and on top, upon this semblance of a throne, there was a semblance of a human form. From what appeared as his loins up, I saw a gleam as of amber, of what looked like a fire encased in a frame. And from what appeared as his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. There was a radiance all about him, like the appearance of the bow which shines in the clouds on a day of rain. Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking.
Great. Okay, great way to end the chapter, by the way. We'll go on a little bit, but so you talked about getting psyched up, but in fact, what happens to him? He flings himself down. He can't take it, and we'll see later on. Just a little hint of what's going to happen later after this entire experience, which is not over yet. Before he actually starts preaching, he gives himself a sort of self-imposed time out for 7 days. He's got to get over the emotional trauma of what has happened here. Right? This is the way I see this. Is God, and not just me, by the way, but others too. God is like pulverizing the prophets to make the prophets prepared to accept, and what's the better word for it? To internalize God's, not just God's message, but God's word in the heaviest sense. the message could be something like you just dictate. But God was not a dictator. God not really, the prophets didn't really take dictation. Like I said before, Keschel says the prophets were God was plunged into them. Okay? Again, not to say that the prophets lose themselves entirely, but God is plunged into the very depths. I think it's Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk, we never really think about Habakkuk, said, when he was called by God, his loins were quaking. No, his bowels rather. His bowels were quaking in his throat, in his call narrative. It's like, it's inside you, which is interesting because bowels is something that's going to actually come up again with these prophets. So here you have, and I'm tempted to do Isaiah now, but we're going to wait until next week. It's a much shorter vision. But they are, and Jeremiah says, in a part that we're not going to read, that the fire is shut up in his very bones. Right? So you gotta imagine this. Like God is like, I don't know how you just imagine your deepest grief, maybe, or your greatest joy, and you feel it physically, or some sort of ecstasy that you've experienced, although I hesitate to use the word ecstasy because these are not ecstatic prophets, but where you really feel it inside you. We go through life so often a little bit superficially, and we have to. But this is not. This is the opposite of a superficial experience. This is a plunged into your very being experience, and we're going to see it even more in a moment. Yes?
The word comes to mind that he's inhabited.
Inhabited is nice. 2 new words for me to describe this. Inhabited is good. Engulfed is very good. Amos, which we might not get to, talks about like a plumbing, like it's like a plumber's rod or some sort of instrument, which I forget the name of, is like inside him, like it's in. Okay? Submerged is also good. Although submerged is it's like you're submerged in something, as opposed to something being submerged in you. Right. Okay. So do you want to start chapter 2? We have what's the official time?
11:30.
It's 11:30?
Yeah.
11:20.
We have 7 minutes.
11:20.
Okay, the official time. Who's our timekeeper? Okay, so he flings himself on the ground. I flung myself on the ground. Just take a quick look at the Hebrew, see if it's what are I? The pole, and I fell on my face. I need the Eshman Kol Midamer. And I heard it, I fell to the ground on my face, rather. I fell on my face, and I heard a voice that was speaking. Okay? And so what is this voice saying? Let's begin with this. Chapter 2. Anyone want to read?
And he said to me, O mortal, stand up on your feet, that I may speak to you. As he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me upon my feet. And I heard what was being spoken to me. He said to me, O mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, the nation of rebels who have rebelled against me. They, as well as their fathers, have defied me to this very day. For the sons are brazen of face and stubborn of heart. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus said the Lord God, whether they listen or not, for they are a rebellious breed, that they may know that there is a prophet among them.
Good, very good. Okay, so first, O mortal. What is it in the Hebrew?
Ben Adam.
Ben Adam. Yeah, Ben Adam, son of man, Adam, like a human being. Ben Adam, right. So we see this, what do you think? Why, and this, I don't know if it's not used anywhere else in the Bible, but it's used, I think, 90 times in Ezekiel. I don't think it's used anywhere else. Maybe it is, I don't know. I think it's used in the Gospels, by the way. Isn't Jesus sometimes referred to as Son of Man? Am I right about that?
Son of God.
Right, but isn't, I don't know, I think that sometimes it's referred to as Son of Man as well, which is interesting. Maybe I'm wrong about that. It's not my area. Jewish. So, what do you think? Why? What are the implications? Is there any why is God referring to Ezekiel as Ben Adam? Yes.
Maybe he's saying you are a man, you're not making you a God.
Okay, good. That's good. So one thing is that gulf. In other words, I am God, you're a man, and remember that. So some commentators see this as, say, after everything that Ezekiel has just experienced, this is divine. You're a man. You're immortal. And so note the difference, Ezekiel. You're just immortal. Yes, 1 and 2.
Yeah, you had started about an hour and a half ago asking us, what does it mean you're being told that you're a prophet? And
Right.
talked about the responsibility and the hierarchy of it. And now he's being put back into his place. Okay, that's all wonderful. But
Okay, good. Yeah, that is very good. That making the distinction between that and you, and like know who you are, know what you are, even with the responsibility, it's just humbling in a way.
don't get too full of yourself.
Don't get too full of yourself. Good. Yes.
I keep thinking God up here and down earth, that you're earthbound. And
Very, very nice. Then Adam. You could almost think, of course, Adam means earthling. Adam means earthling. Right? We say he, Adam, but it's earthling because Adam comes from Adamah, right, which means earth. Adamah means earth. So right, and we just saw the rakia. We just saw the throne above the rakia, above the expanse. We saw heaven. He saw heaven. And this is you. You were made of dirt, literally. Or as Joni Mitchell said, we are stardust. We are gold. Right? Song? What's up? What's up? Other comments? Yes?
Know your place.
Know your place. Good. Very, very good. Know your place. Know where you are in relation to me. So a couple of other things. By the way, the Midrash saw this Ben Adam epithet as not only know your place because you're a human, but almost the passing judgment on Ezekiel himself, interestingly, because of the sort of the extensive nature of his description of the vision of God. The rabbis are saying, what are you too many words, Ezekiel? This is too much. Isaiah's throne room vision, his vision in his throne room when he was called to be a prophet, was much more terse. It's 9 verses or something like that, which we'll see. And this is 2 big chapters, in the middle of the 3rd chapter, really. So it's passing judgment like, Ezekiel, you should have kind of kept this to yourself a little bit. You could have described it somewhat, but you didn't have to blow our minds like this, and maybe that was part of their discomfort with making this part of the canon. Okay? Very nice. Ruach. Spirit. Right? Is this translated as spirit or wind? Sometimes it's wind. As he spoke to me, a spirit entered me. V'tavo the ruach. And it came to me a spirit. And what did it do? Yeah, because he had fallen down, remember. So the spirit, he's a prophet puppet, in a sense. Imagine, I see God as like a puppet master. He's not just kind of like, standing up. I see that, he's on the ground. He had fallen on his face, like Moses and Aaron had done, and many others when they were experiencing some sort of like cataclysmic event. This is his cataclysmic event. And the Ruach comes and whoosh, and he's kind of like borne aloft, just like put on his feet like this. This is the prophet as puppet. Interesting to think of the prophets as puppets in a way. I mean, they're not, but they're definitely manipulated. Okay? And then, but interesting. And this is a modern scholar named Moshe Greenberg. I'm not a 20th century scholar. Moshe Greenberg thought it was interesting and important, meaningful, that God did not speak to the prophet when the prophet was down there. Here, Moshe Greenberg is being a little bit like Heschel. In other words, to be a prophet, yes, you are, whatever it is, inhabited and submerged and engulfed and all those other things, but you're also a human, you're also a man. In other words, you're not totally wiped out. Okay, that's an important thing. I'm not always sure that I believe it, because we see him kind of being wiped out here. But the idea with Moshe Greenberg and Abraham Joshua Heschel is that you've got to be standing upright for this. And you don't become a puddle of egoless, amorphous nothing. You got a spine, and you're still Ezekiel after all this. Interesting. I think it's true, but I like it. Also, the words we see the word shalach. What is that word? Right. Shin, lamed, chet, shalach. Send. We see this over and over again. We see this over and over again in the prophets. What does God do? God sends them, which seems like such a simple thing. You send someone to do a mission, but it's not so simple. because God is more than sending them, God is thrusting them into something. With the prophet Amos, you know, where was Amos from? He was spread to coaches in Judah, and where did he have to preach? Up in the northern kingdom. This is 2 centuries earlier than this. Up in Israel. So God says, you know, you got to leave your home. Amos says, I'm a farmer. You know, I tend sycamore trees. Too bad. I'm sending you out. You know, it's the compulsion aspect of this. You're being pushed out, not really just to preach to your people, but to go into a different kingdom. Remember, there are 2 kingdoms. There is Judah in the south and Israel in the north. You cross the border and go. I don't want to go. I'm sending you out. Shalach. Okay? Good. Where are we now? Oh, it's 11:30. Is it not?
Yes.
Okay. Terrific. This has been very enjoyable. I appreciate it. Thank you. We will continue then with verse 4, right? Or 6. Okay, let's all remember that. I'll make notes next week at this time. Thank you so much. Ezekiel? Very, very good question. The question here, sort of a final question, which is a segue to next week. Did God expect Ezekiel to change things? No. But it doesn't mean that God didn't send him anyway. Very good. Yeah, that's good. Very good.